The consultancy Control Risks has published a new report examining the risks and rewards for investing on our continent, and suggests, in fact, that Africa has to deal with rising polarization in the world, particularly because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It also looks at which countries are likely to grow strongly and where it could be risky to invest money. Vincent Rouget is the head of political and business risk analysis for sub-Saharan Africa at Control Risks. Vincent, good afternoon to you. One of your major themes is about the risk of polarization. You talk about fragmentation as well, mainly because of the war in Ukraine. How is this affecting countries in Africa?
Good afternoon, Stephen, and thanks for having me today. Yes, absolutely. It is one of the themes that we wanted to emphasize in this year's edition of the Africa Risk Reward Index. We've seen just generally a much more polarized environment with obviously a growing competition between Russia, the US, but also China, which has long been an established player on the continent. And we see more and more foreign policy of these countries towards Africa being more transactional, trying to get African countries to align with their foreign policy views. And that is posing a challenge to many African countries who don't want to align, who want to continue to be able to trade, to receive investment from as many partners as possible. So we're seeing this interesting game on the part of many African countries that are trying to maintain a non-aligned stance and a neutral position as much as they can, but also trying to make the most of this growing geopolitical competition. And there are areas, for example, minerals, where that competition could be playing to Africa's advantage.
I mean, South Africa may be the perfect example for you. We say we're non-aligned, and we've seen ourselves almost being pushed around a little by maybe the United States, for example. It's not a comfortable place to be.
Absolutely, and I think South Africa illustrates probably more the pitfalls of that polarization, where we've seen the country's reputation, particularly in the US, take a bit of a hit over the last few months amid the numerous allegations that you just mentioned. The country is still trying to find a balance between the US, between Russia, between China. But we've seen in the case of South Africa to what extent this geopolitical fragmentation can now act as a bit of a drain on investment, on investor sentiment, on the stock exchange as well, and on the rand as well.
You actually assign, well, I'm South African, so I thought it was a high level of risk to South Africa. What are you worried about?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for us, so South Africa has unfortunately been one of the laggards in this year's index. We've seen their ratio of risk versus reward decline, whereas others have improved. In the case of South Africa, it's a combination of things and factors driving this result. One, on the economic side, is the impact that the power crisis is having on growth, on consumer sentiment, on investor sentiment. It is also the approaching elections due next year, and the feeling that the administration is struggling to send consistent policy signals towards investors in a number of areas. And we're at a time where investors in a number of sectors, be it the energy sector, the mining industry, to name just a couple, are really craving for consistent policy direction, which the government seems unable to give at the moment.
The other big issue we see, and if we look at our continent generally now, but certainly since the pandemic, has been the number of coups in Africa. We see it in the Sahel. We see conflict in Sudan and in Ethiopia. Are you worried that some of that could spread?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've seen a return of headline political risk instability in its worst forms, with about 7 military coups in West Africa since 2020, the latest just a couple of weeks ago in Gabon. Now, these coups have different causes. They're all driven by various domestic factors, but they have a few things in common. One is a general sense of disillusion with the established political class. There is also an element of contagion. Military officers talk to other military officers in the region. They share advice. They see that these military coups are, by and large, popular with public opinion. And so we do see a risk that that instability could spread, and a few other countries could also be at risk of those kinds of military takeovers over the next few months. I don't want to give the impression that this is a continent-wide threat. Many countries have virtually zero risk of military interference in politics, and the strongest predictor of a coup remains a history of military coup previously. So for those looking at where could be next, the advice would be to look at where coups have already happened and where in the region are more vulnerable. It is not a continent-wide phenomenon that is going to sweep across.
So, Vincent, I mean, as you talk, it makes me think that in southern Africa over the last 30 years, 40 years maybe, we've had a really good history of strengthening democracy. But you talk about places where there's a history of coups, and this has happened in one place in southern Africa, and I'm talking about Zimbabwe, where we saw a coup back in 2017, a very contested election. There's now a president who's appointed two of his relatives, his son and nephew, to his own cabinet in Zimbabwe. I mean, if there's going to be a coup in southern Africa, I suppose Zimbabwe would be the place.
It would. I mean, in a region that, as you said, otherwise, little recent history of military interference, it is the most exposed. Now, we can say that the military is already well represented in the current power structure, and perhaps its intensive may not lie in disrupting the current state of play. I think the challenge for Zimbabwe now, post-election, is more trying to find bridges, enough of a bridge with, on one side, the opposition, and on the other, the international community, to be able to re-engage internationally. A lot of international observers were hoping that this election was going to be the right moment to cautiously re-engage. Now, we've seen a lot of criticism coming out of electoral observers around the election, so the re-engagement will probably be much slower and much more cautious than even some people envisaged. But that is the real challenge now for the administration, partly to manage to keep its economy afloat as well.
If the war in Europe ended, and I realize it's a sort of counterfactual question, but if the Russia-Ukraine conflict came to some kind of vaguely sustainable peace, will that make a big difference to what's happening in Africa? I suppose what I'm really asking is, how big a factor is the war?
It is a factor, particularly when it comes to food prices, and we've seen the conflict in Ukraine really driving up food prices by disrupting grain exports. So in that sense, if there was to be, and you're right to say it is a counterfactual, if there was to be a sustainable peace agreement that were allowed, able to restore grain exports, I think that would be the immediate positive impact on the continent. On the other hand, the position of Russia as, fundamentally opposed to Western interests, as using Africa to disrupt some of those Western interests, is unlikely to change in the longer term, even if there were to be a resolution of the conflict in Ukraine. And so the kind of games that we talked about just a few minutes ago around positioning of countries vis-a-vis Russia, that's unlikely to cease for at least as long as the current Russian power structure remains unchanged.
Vincent Rouget, as a South African, may I wish you and France the best of luck for the rest of the Rugby World Cup, but not too much.
And likewise.
Not too much luck, if I may say. Vincent Rouget is the Head of Political and Risk Analysis for Sub-Saharan Africa for Control Risks. Well,